cameras or your microphones on. But I just wanted to say I appreciate you being here and listening in. And I always enjoy having a chance to talk with other educators and people who work with young children because we all can make such a difference in their lives and in their development. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So just bear with me 1 second. Oh, hang on. Oh, and sorry, I have to, oh, you see all my emails here. Hang on 1 second. I have to get out of this section. I had it all set for the last presentation. Okay, let's try that again. Always some technical difficulties. There we go. All right, Susan, can you see that slideshow okay? Great. Okay, I'm going to close that window. All right, so today what I'm going to talk to you about is speech and language development in early childhood, but I really want to focus this time around on talking about the collaboration that we can do as teachers with service providers and with families to make sure that children are getting the support they need between home and the classroom. So a little bit about me. Most of you have probably seen me speak before. Not much of this has changed. I'm a speech language pathologist as well as a Montessori guide. Some new things for me. I've had some additional training over the past couple of years, working with Gestalt language processing, which is a form of communication often used by children on the autism spectrum, as well as oral facial myofunctional disorders, which have to do with the oral motor mechanism and how we use our musculature to speak and to swallow and things like that. So another new addition is that in addition to helping out with the WSMIS TEP program for their early childhood training, I'm also now a teacher for their Montessori Inclusion Endorsement Program, which looks at special education best practices in the Montessori environment. And I'm excited to be here talking with you all today because I love talking to fellow Montessorians. So here are our goals for today. We're going to talk, as usual, about those typical patterns and milestones in speech and language development. Some of this is going to be a review for those of you who've seen me speak before, but I'm hoping we can add a little bit of new information for you. And then we're also going to be talking about the importance of observation of children's speech and language development in the classroom, tools that you can use to help you decide if you think that there might be a concern of some kind, and then how to approach families if you think that you need to talk to them about any speech or language concerns that you have. I also want to touch on the evaluation process and what that looks like if a child has to go for a full speech and language evaluation, and how important you are as a member of the child's team when that does occur. And finally, the overarching theme here is just that important aspect of collaborating with service providers and with families to make sure that the children are getting what they need. So you've heard me say this before, speech and language are two different things. We're going to talk about them a lot today. Speech is how we say words, the sounds that we make. It includes articulation, the quality of our voice, and fluency, so how smooth or bumpy our speech might be. Language is going to be all about the words that we're using and then how we put those words together to share ideas or to understand what other people are saying to us. And so that's going to include things like vocabulary, grammar, and we're going to talk a little bit this year as well about pragmatic language, which is that social language skill. So something new that I wanted to add here, and this is going to be particularly interesting for those of you in the infant and toddler environment, is the early development of oral motor skills. So before we even start talking about speech or language, we need to talk about how children are using their mouths, how they're moving the musculature and the structures in their mouths, and what that's going to do for them later as they're learning how to speak. So for those of you working with very young children, especially if you have infants of your own, you know that their very first movement is going to be that supple reflex, right? This is how they're going to be taking in nutrition, whether it's through a bottle or breast. They need to have that reflex. But around 9 months of age is the age where children start getting control of their tongue to start mashing food. So that's very different from chewing. This is where it's just the tongue going up against the roof of the mouth and kind of smashing things. So this is why we start off with things like puree food as early solids for children. Around this age, this is also where you should start to see children able to close their lips together to stop food from spilling out as they're trying to move the food around with their tongue. And the tongue might move back and forth to move the food from side to side as well. As children start to get their teeth that are growing in, those first set of teeth that they all have, you'll start to notice more of a chewing component to their eating skills and their motor skills. And so what they do is early on, it's going to be a little bit of up and down, but as they refine their chewing, you're going to start seeing a more what we call rotary pattern. So it's going to be a little bit more circular. Their jaw is going to move a little bit more side to side, maybe in both directions, maybe in one. But this is going to be a movement that they refine all the way through the age of 4. So very young children are still working on perfecting their ability to chew, which is why sometimes it's so important to remind them to chew when they're eating things that maybe they haven't encountered before, or when they're chewing on something that's particularly tough, a reminder to keep moving and keep chewing. So while these are all really important skills for eating, we also need to recognize that the muscles being used are the same muscles that the children are going to use as they start to speak. And they're going to need these muscles to create very specific speech sounds. Something that's going to get in the way of that is prolonged use of pacifiers, bottles, and sippy cups, because it's just going to reinforce that suckle reflex, which is just a little bit of sucking, very little movement of the jaw or the lips. And so that's not going to allow the musculature in the mouth to develop properly if children are continuously using those things beyond the age at which they need to. So you'll be happy to know I already brought this up with any of the parents that were in the parent presentation. So if you notice a child is reaching, the age of 2, 3, please by 4, don't let them be using a pacifier. It's going to be affecting so many structures in their mouths. And it's okay to mention that to a parent that, developmentally, for the sake of their musculature, the sake of their teeth, it's going to be really important to start to wean off of those things. Another thing I like to say is, I'm sure many of you do this in your classrooms, especially in the early childhood environment. Don't use sippy cups, just go right to an open top cup. Children, even very young children, can learn to drink from an open top cup. It's going to take a little practice, but that actually is going to help teach them oral motor control. That will be very useful as they're learning to speak as well.
Jessa,
Yes.
one of the things we have water bottles, okay, like
Okay.
everyone carries around like adults,
Yep.
and a lot of times the kids do put the water bottles on the shelf so whenever they get thirsty. So are you suggesting maybe that for lunchtime or like, I mean, should we be eliminating all water bottles or do you think it's okay to like, how would we do that?
That's a great question. So, in my classroom, and I know it can be a little different. I'm going to put this out there. I realize that in the city, you guys have very different requirements from the DOH that we don't necessarily have here in upstate. So, in my classroom, we always had a set of open top, just small juice glasses that we left out, and the children could take a glass and we had a water source and they could put water in it whenever they were thirsty and then they'd put their cup in the sink and we'd do dishes at the end of the day, but we always had a large supply of cups. I know that that's a little different because of like the sanitation and things like that in the city,
No,
requirements for
we
how.
could still do it. I think
Mhm.
there was a choice made at some point. And I mean, I think teachers do still use the small cups as well to learn how to do that. But I think it's more the fact that people just they got in the habit of like adults do,
They
just
do.
having their water bottles.
Yeah.
And we don't have any
Yeah.
single-use plastics and stuff like that. So I guess it's a discussion
Sure.
we have.
Yeah,
But
and that's going to be dependent on your teachers and the classrooms. And I wouldn't say there's anything wrong with water bottles. I would say look for the water bottles that have a straw as opposed to some of them have like those little spout tops. or almost like a sippy top lid. I would try to encourage parents to send in ones with straws because that's still going to encourage a little bit different movement than what you get with a spout or a sippy cup. So, but that's a conversation that you can certainly have. And, if it works for your classrooms to, at certain points in the day, to use open top cups, then that's great. It's also something you can talk to parents about, like, oh, this is a skill they could be practicing at home. Maybe we don't do it in the classroom, but be aware that you can practice with an open top cup at home as well. So some more early milestones of speech development before we're actually getting into speech itself, like trying to put words together. You're going to be looking at different vocalizations that children make. So in the infant classroom, you're probably going to notice that there's a lot of cooing up to 6 months, not really a lot of speech sounds, but just a lot of noises. These are the ways that children are playing around with their oral musculature and learning to make sounds. But it's not until about 7 to 12 months that we start to see that babbling and some consonant sounds. And those early consonants we've talked about before, you're always going to see those front sounds, anything made with your lips. Those are the things that you're going to start to see first. And you're going to go through canonical babbling, which is your repetitive, like da, 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 ma, 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 ma. And then it will slowly move into that variegated babbling where the sounds differ. You get different consonant sounds, different vowel sounds, bido, bada, that sort of thing. Um, and around a year old, between 12 and 14 months, is where you are hoping to hear a child say their first words. It's usually going to be one or two words by this point, not an extensive vocabulary by any means, but they're also still working on those different speech sounds that they had started to work on from 7 to 12 months. Um, I've shared this speech sound acquisition chart with you in the past, but I know Susan has a copy and she'll share that with you again. Just remember that the speech sounds develop on a continuum, right? So we're starting with all those front sounds between 2 and 3 years old. You're going to see P, M, H, N, W, B. We've also, with the chart on the right, we've included D as an early forming sound because that is made pretty far in the front. So children start to develop that fairly young. The chart on the right I find to be a little bit easier to read if you're just looking at hard stops, like, okay, around 2 years old, they should be doing these sounds. 3 years old, they should be starting to make these sounds, and so on and so forth. The main thing to take away from this is that by 5 years old, they should have most of their speech sounds with a few residual sounds that are going to refine from 5 to 6. The R, the voiced and voiceless TH, so and then that I put ZH because it's always nobody wants to see the international phonetic alphabet symbol. It's that zh sound, like in measure. So that's what you're looking at when you're looking at children going through your classrooms and you're listening to them speaking. Of course, there's going to be errors because they're still learning how to make all these sounds. But if you're ever curious about the sounds a child is making, should they have that sound yet, these charts are a really great resource for you. And then when it comes to difficulties, if you think, I don't know. There's certain things that make me question, does a child have a speech sound difficulty? The things you want to look for are, first of all, are they hard to understand? And of course, that's going to be dependent on who's listening, but we try to use these percentages as our sort of, a benchmark. So by 3 years old, a child should be 50% intelligible to people who are familiar with them. Unknown listeners might not understand even half. But people who are around children, a child all the time, should understand about 50% of what they say by 3. So those of you working with younger children, if you can't understand 50% of what they're saying, that's actually okay. If they're 2 years old and you're struggling to understand what's being said, that's not a major concern yet. But as they're approaching 3, you should be able to get about half of what they're saying. By 4 years old, you should be able to understand about 75%. And by 5 years old, we say 90% of the time you should understand a child, whether you know that child or not. They should really be understood almost all of the time by anyone listening. So if the child is not meeting those percentages, you might have some concerns. The other thing that you want to look out for is if the speech sound errors persist beyond the age that you would expect the sound to be acquired. So if you have a child who's 5 years old and can't make the B sound, B, then you definitely want to have that looked at. That would not be a typical pattern of development. Um, I talked a little bit with the parents about this. It's something that people don't really think about necessarily. When children are learning to talk, they drop a lot of sounds out of words because they're trying to simplify. They're trying to make it easier for themselves. That's a pretty normal thing for children to do if the sound that they're eliminating happens at the end of the word. So if they're trying to say the word cat and they say cat, that happens, right? And we would expect to see that happening with children up to 3 years old. By the time they're 4, they should really be saying the sounds at the ends of their words too. But if you have a child who's not making a sound at the beginning of a word, that's not a typical error we would see, and that's something we would want to look at right away, because that's not something that we think a child is going to outgrow on their own. Another sign of difficulty would be what's called backing. So that's where you're taking a front sound like a T or a D, and you're producing it as a back sound like a K or a G. So instead of the word cat, you would say cack. Or instead of the word dog, you would say gog. You're putting all the sounds in the back. And sometimes it's fun, especially if you're just sitting there quietly in a room and nobody's looking at you. You can practice making these sounds and you can feel your tongue actually moves backwards for that and g sound. Another thing to look out for is if the speech sound errors that a child makes are inconsistent. Usually a child will make errors and it's going to be the same error all the time. But if they're saying the same word and they're making vastly different speech sound errors each time they say it. So let's say they're saying the word duck, and one time they say Doug, and another time they say Sib, and they're just very strange, unrelated errors that you're seeing. That might actually be the sign of what's called a motor planning difficulty, which has less to do with the musculature and much more to do with cognitive planning of motor movements. And so we would definitely want to take a look at a child who's making errors that are inconsistent. And then the last two things are groping, which is like they're trying to, it looks like they're almost reaching for the sound with their mouth and not getting it, and excessive or uncontrolled drooling. Obviously, if you're working with infants and even toddlers, you're going to see some drool sometimes. But if you have an older child, that 3, 4, 5-year-old who constantly has saliva coming out of their mouth, that might be a sign of lip inconsistency and instability, and they might need some strengthening work to help them control that. Other things that we're looking for in speech, we talked about fluency in the past, so it is okay for children to have repetitions in their speech, especially when they're first learning how to talk. So from 18 months to 3 years old, you will probably hear a child saying a sound or a syllable over again as they're trying to get a word out. By 3 years and older, you're going to see a lot less of that. And if you do see repetitions, we really only expect to see children repeating whole words or even whole phrases, or maybe using filler words like uh, hopefully they're not saying like by 3, but that happens every now and then. But that would be typical. Those are things that we expect to see as children are learning to speak because we see their brains are trying to move very quickly. They know what they want to say, and it's about getting that oral motor musculature to catch up with what they're trying to get out. The times that you would be concerned about fluency are if a child is doing those single sound repetitions and they're beyond that, like 18 months to 3 years. They're like 3, 3.5, 4 years old, and they're doing a lot of sound repetition like mum, 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 mum. That would be atypical. We would want to look at that. The other things to look out for would be blocks, and that's where a child is trying to get sound out and nothing is coming out. Prolongations, which is actually stretching a sound out. So instead of repeating mom, 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 they might do mom. And it's not that they're trying to hold it, it's that they can't move from that first sound to to beyond and start that second sound. And then if you see any secondary characteristics with blocks or repetitions or prolongations, that's a sign that we really want to get a look at things because it means a child is noticing that they're making these errors. So you want to look out for, again, that groping, kind of reaching for words, and also facial grimacing, which is where they might be like, scrunching their eyes or doing a lot of eye blinking as they're trying to talk. So the disfluencies that we see in children, pretty typical until about 3 years old. But then as you're getting into 2, 3 years, if you start to see these things happening and they're lasting for longer than 6 months, we would definitely want to take a look at them. So now we'll jump into language development. So remember, expressive language is how we share our thoughts and ideas. Receptive language is understanding what other people are saying. And pragmatic language, we're going to get into a little bit more today. That is the understanding of social language, social cues, the ability to read nonverbals, and understanding how that all plays a role in communication with others. So children, as a reminder, are always going to understand more than they can express as they're developing language. So receptive language development from 7 months to about a year old, this is where children are starting to learn to understand that sounds that they're hearing are actual words, then they mean something. So they're going to notice when their name is being called. They're going to know what you're talking about. If you say ball and you point, they're going to know you're talking about the ball. They might even, if they're mobile, be able to respond to requests like, come to me. From 1 to 2 years old, they're going to be able to follow really simple commands with objects like roll the ball, or you might say the name of something and they can point at it. And they can even respond to simple questions. And simple questions are often those WH questions: who, what, where. Um, from 2 to 4 years old, then you start to get the ability to answer when and why. But remember, when refers to time, and that's a very abstract concept, and why has to do with reasoning. So again, very abstract, much more cognitively challenging skill than just answering what, who, and where. Those are usually very concrete ideas. So 1 to 2 years old, you get those first few WH questions. 2 to 4 years old is where you're going to start developing the ability to answer beyond that. They also are able to start following more complex directions. So a 2-year-old is probably only going to be able to follow directions with one step at a time, whereas a 3-year-old, 4-year-old, they're starting to develop the ability to follow 2 steps, maybe even into 3 steps. By 5 years old, they can probably follow a 3-step direction. They might even be able to do it with temporal directions, time directions. So before you put on your shoes, let's hang your bag or something like that. And around 5 is also where we're going to notice that children can not only listen to a story, but they're going to be able to retain that information and then respond to questions about it. So we all love reading to children in our classrooms, and it's a wonderful thing. From day one, we should be reading to them, but that expectation that they will then be able to recall and respond to questions about the stories, we don't really expect to see that as a skill that they can do on a regular basis until about 5 years old. So then on the expressive side, children's ability to share with us what they are thinking or feeling. 7 months to a year old, again, it's just a lot of babbling, not necessarily a lot of intention behind it, but they are able to express things physically. So you might see pointing, right? Or arms up is their signal for like, pick me up, please. So some of the early expressive language in children is not necessarily going to be verbal, but it might be physical signing of some kind. And then, of course, like we said, we hope that by their first birthday, they have 1 or 2 words. Definitely by 14 months, we'd like to see at least a word or two. And then from 1 to 2 years, those of you who are fortunate enough to work in a classroom with children of this age, this is where that explosion happens. And they're learning new words almost every day. As they're getting close to 2 years old, they might even be putting 2 words together. Some kids might even be putting 3 words together, although that's not the expectation. And they might even be able to ask really simple questions like, where mommy? or who dat, they might not have all of the grammar in place yet, but they're able to put these ideas together and get what they need. From 2 to 4 years old, we're expecting a child to have a word for almost everything that is familiar to them in their environment. They should be able to talk about daily events, whether it's talking about home, talking about school, talking about things that are familiar to them. And by 4 years old, we hope that they are starting to use sentences with four or more words. So around two, we're putting two words together. By the time we get to four, we're putting four words together. And then by 5 years old, being able to tell stories. And of course, we know children's stories can be a little rambling, but having a, a relative sequence is good, a clear beginning and a clear ending. And sometimes the middle gets a little hazy, but they should be able to tell very simple stories in sequence. And they also should be able to talk easily with their peers as well as with adults in their environment. Then we move to pragmatic language. And so speaking with peers and adults, it kind of lends itself to pragmatic language. When you think about the way children speak with each other and with their friends versus how they speak with teachers versus how they speak with their parents, this all is relative to pragmatic language, the social language rules that we use. And so I have some highlights here just to give you an idea of what it looks like early on. And I even go beyond the early childhood age just so you can see where children are going with their pragmatic language skills. But from birth to three, so our infants, our young toddlers, the first thing that children should have in their development toolbox is that they're noticing faces. Children should be very drawn to faces when they're infants. They should be able to build that visual memory for familiar individuals. And they're also making facial expressions. So they should recognize when someone is smiling at them and be able to smile back or show a facial expression showing maybe fear or even sadness. They should have these facial expressions available to them. And they should also be able to engage as they reach 3 years old, engage in very short dialogues like, good morning, how are you today? I'm fine or I'm good. It might just be one or two turns. It might be the adult saying, how are you? And the child says, good. And they haven't yet learned that socially they're expected to then return and say, how are you today? That's going to come a little bit later as we get to 3 to 5 years old. They're going to have those longer dialogues and that conversational turn taking. How are you this morning? I'm good. How are you? Oh, I'm tired today, but I'm ready to play. Yes, me too. That back and forth that we see in conversation. So children sometimes have to learn how to take appropriate turns in conversation. And I know that our Montessori grace and courtesy lessons often lend themselves to demonstrating to children what conversational turn taking can look like, what it looks like to politely interrupt someone versus jumping in and just saying what you want to say when it's not your turn. So all of those things that we do with grace and courtesy or any circle time activities that you do that encourage children to wait, to raise their hand, to take turns with one another, that's all, those are all ways that you're teaching children pragmatic language skills. Children at this age also, so if you're in an early childhood classroom, you probably see a lot of this. They are learning how to use humor. Knock knock jokes are huge with the 3 to 5 year old set. They engage in fantasy and imaginative play. The pouring work suddenly becomes a restaurant. Who wants, tea today? I'm going to hand it out to you. They're learning how to use language to engage in these make-believe scenarios. They're also able to recognize if their communication isn't going so well. So if a child says something to someone and the person gives them a look, maybe
I
scrunches their
love the reading
brow or
together,
tilts
but
their
it does
head
make things
and looks like they have a question on their face, children around 4 to 5 years old are going to start to recognize that and start to clue in to, hmm, they didn't get my message. Maybe I'll try to say it again, or they might ask what's wrong, but they're going to notice if the communication didn't go the way that they expected it to. And this also lends itself to this understanding of theory of mind, right? That is the concept of knowing that I have my thoughts and my feelings, but other people have their own thoughts and feelings. They might be the same as mine, they might be different from mine. Children prior to this age really don't understand, don't have that concept of other people having different thoughts and different feelings. So 3 to 5 years old is where we expect children to really start to begin developing this skill. And that's going to continue on even as they go, beyond through that early adolescence and even all the way up into adulthood. That concept of theory of mind, putting myself in another person's shoes, taking another person's perspective, that will continue to develop as a child grows and has the ability for more abstract kind of thinking. Again, I know that no one on this call right now is working with older children or adolescents. You do work with adults. We all work with one another. So it doesn't hurt to just understand what pragmatic language looks like for people at different ages. So, those older elementary children into that maybe middle school age, they're starting to understand what we call meta pragmatics, really understanding social rules. Oh, I would never say that to that person. Like I might think that, I'm not going to say it. That's where we start to see some of these like deeper pragmatic skills coming in. And they might start to understand sarcasm or making inferences. And then as you get into the older adolescents and adults, so the people that you work with every day, you're able to competently use verbal communication, but you can also understand someone's tone of voice, their nonverbal communication. If someone's sitting here like this with their arms crossed, you know as an adult that they are uncomfortable for some reason or upset. Um, and you're able to develop empathy for people and you're forming strong relationships. So I like to include this information here because, there's sometimes an expectation for our very young children to have some of these higher level skills. And while we can't really expect a child of, 3 years old to have a total understanding of empathy, we know that the work we're doing with them to teach that skill is building into who they're becoming as they get older and move into adolescence and move into adulthood. So I like to include that information there, just as kind of a highlight of what's to come. A quick note, on bilingual language development. I know that you all work in classrooms with children from many different cultures. English may or may not be your first language. You might have families who speak multiple languages beyond even just one, beyond just two languages. There might be three languages. So I just like to remind you as an educator that children who are bilingual or learning more than one language are able to learn just as easily as a child who's learning one language. They're just going to look a little different. And so there's no increased risk that they're going to have any kind of delay or a language disorder. But what you're going to see is it's going to look like less language in each of the languages they're learning. So some common traits that you're going to see, that code mixing where they mix some sound or some words from one language and words from another language and they mash it up into one sentence. And so maybe you only understand half of what they're saying. Or if you're fortunate enough to know both of the languages, you'll know what they're telling you even though they've switched back and forth. That's very common and it's to be expected for children learning to speak more than one language at a time. As adults, it sometimes makes us feel that a child doesn't have the same level of vocabulary as a child who's only learning one language. But I like to offer the example that, by 2 years old, we expect children to have about 100 words. If a child is only learning one language, all 100 words are going to be in the one language. If a child is learning two languages, 50 of those words might be in language one, and 50 of those words might be in language two. So they only have 50 words in each language, but they still have a total of 100. We would never expect them to have 100 words in every single language if they're learning more than one, because that's actually far too advanced for them. So it's similar to a monolingual learner. It's just that the words are broken up across different languages. And then if a child is learning, maybe they're exposed to one language more than the other, it might be a little more uneven. Maybe language one gets spoken at home and by a teacher at school, and so they have maybe 70 words in language one. and there's only one teacher at school who speaks language two with them. So maybe they only have 30 words, but you're still looking for that 100 vocabulary words approximately by 2 years of age. For parents or teachers who are interested in promoting their children to be bilingual, it's just important to remind them that the exposure needs to be as equal as you can make it. So if there's a lot of language one at home, let's focus on language two at school. Or if there's one person in the family who speaks one language that another family member doesn't speak, let's let person one is going to speak language one to the child, and person two will speak language two to the child. The idea is that you just use whatever arrangement is best for the family, or maybe you work with the family as the school staff. You're talking to them about, oh, would you prefer we only speak English to them at school? And just work with them to make sure that the child is getting everything they need to be able to develop both languages. So let's talk a little bit about what it looks like if a child is having language difficulties. We talked about those speech difficulties. Language difficulties are going to be things like having no words by 18 months of age, or a very limited vocabulary. Maybe they only have about 10 words and they're 18 months old. Or if they're having trouble like naming things that are in their environment every day and you've taught them these words. The thing about having no words, no verbal words by 18 months old, it's a little different than the speech difficulties. So speech and articulation, we typically don't work with children. As a speech pathologist, I wouldn't work with a child under the age of 3 on their speech sounds, because they need to be able to follow directions. First of all, they have to have the executive functioning skills for that, but they also have time to still develop those skills. Language, because it's a more cognitive skill, we really want to catch it early. And so if you have a child who's 18 months old and has no words yet, that's going to be something you want to talk to the parents about, because that is concerning. And the sooner we start working with the child, the sooner they're going to be able to catch up. Other things to look out for are if a child is mostly using gestures and not using verbal communication, especially if you're getting to that 18-month mark. If they're having word finding issues, so this would be if the child knows a word, has used the word before, and for some reason just can't get the word out. And we all have that happen occasionally, right? We all have a moment where we're like, oh my gosh, what's the word I'm trying to think of? But this would be concerning if you see it happening to a child frequently. That's something we would want to check in on. And I'm going to talk to you in a little bit about how to make observations and assessments before talking to families about these things. Another thing you want to watch out for would be no two-word combinations by 2.5 years old. So again, 18 months to 2 years, we're expecting like a big language explosion. By 2 years old, we expect children to be putting two words together. If they're not doing that by 2.5, there might be something going on that we want to take a look at. And also, if a child has reached 5 years old and they're using sentences that are less than 4 words, we really expect by 4 years old that a child is able to put 4 words together. And so if they're by 5 not doing that, we want to take a look. If a child has difficulty answering questions, again, think about what kind of question you're asking and how old the child is. But if they're a 4 or 5-year-old and you're asking a who question about someone that's familiar to them and they can't answer, or their answer appears off topic, that could be concerning. If they're having difficulty following age-appropriate directions or understanding nonverbal cues, and also if they're having difficulty following along in conversation. So especially those of you who run circle time in your classrooms, if you're noticing that you're having maybe a quick little circle time meeting and you've asked a question and everyone's very eager to answer, and you have a child who has not understood that there was a question asked or doesn't really understand what's happening, you want to be paying attention to those things as well. So with all that in mind, we've talked about development, we've talked about maybe some signs that something's going on, or we might have a concern that we want to share. I know everybody at some point, maybe not now, but in the past, and certainly in the future, you might have this one student who, and you have a concern, and you're not really sure either how to word the concern, or you know what it is, but you don't know how to capture it and to talk to the parents about it. So this next section, I want to go over how we're going to use observation to help us identify what our concerns are, and then how to approach parents to talk about it. So the importance of observation, we are Montessorians. We know, we observe, we take data, we track what children are doing, we plan what their next step is going to be based on what they're doing in the environment. So we're already really, really good at observation. And that's going to serve you well if you have concerns about a child's speech and language development. So just remember that speech and language, they develop on a continuum. So Susan has a bunch of handouts for you that show you, what those developmental milestones look like. Just remember, there's a little bit of leeway on either side, but just be paying attention to what those expectations are as you're helping children to gain these skills. So when you are observing, your observations and data collection are going to be essential. If there's a specific concern, your ability to track that and capture that data is going to be really, really helpful, especially if it comes time to bring in a professional like a speech pathologist to take a look at a child. Some of the things that you can use as a teacher are questionnaires, checklists, screeners. These are all things you can try to complete as a way to get some baseline data to see what might be going on with a child, and then planning for if something more needs to happen with them. So I'm actually going to show you a few different samples, and Susan has all of these to hand out to you as well. You can make copies of them, use them in your classrooms. So the first one is this teacher handout. This is just more of an informational handout. And it's mostly geared towards kindergarten. I did not create this. This was given to me by another speech pathologist, but it shows the different areas of language and speech development, what those areas are, what some red flags are in each of those areas, and then it offers some parental suggestions, things that you can tell parents if you notice any of these red flags. It actually goes on through like first grade and beyond. But I know for most of us on this call, you're mostly going to be concerned with kindergarten or younger. And don't worry, for those of you who work with younger kids, there are some other materials as well that I'm about to show you. But I'm going to go back now. So that's the teacher handout. That's more of an informational handout. Another thing that I like to give out as a speech therapist, so you could be proactive if you have this on hand, is this teacher questionnaire. So if you have a student who has some speech or language concerns, I like this because it's a checkbox, very quick, very easy to fill out kind of thing. If I was handing this out, I would ask a teacher to be filling out all of this information, like the reason for the questionnaire. But for your own use in your classroom, it's just, make sure you have the child's name on it, and then you can just be looking through. These are just specific concerns, and it just gives you ideas of things you might want to be looking out for. And you can check off any of the concerns that you have, right? And it goes through each of the areas that we talked about. And so this is just information gathering for you. This is, like we said, baseline. If you reach a point where you and the parents decide that a child really should have an evaluation and you've completed this checklist, you already have half the information that the speech therapist is going to want from you anyway. So this could be a really great way to be proactive in your approach. So another thing, oops, sorry, let me go back here. Another thing that we have is a kindergarten speech and language screener. I have to admit, this is not my favorite. I find it to be a little bit cumbersome. The reason I want to show it to you and the reason I like it is that it offers a glimpse into some of the longer testing that would happen with a speech pathologist. So I'm going to open this up. So this is it looks at things like, let's answer some WH questions. Now, again, this is a kindergarten age student. You can use it with younger students. Just know that if you're asking WH questions, who, what, when, they might not answer it. I'm not going to expect it for a 3-year-old, where do you eat breakfast? Yeah, they might be able to get that one. Why? unless they're 5, they're probably not going to get it. So you can use this for younger children, but then make sure you're going back and looking at what kinds of things are expected for a child if they're younger than 5. It's going to talk about expressive vocabulary, receptive vocabulary, being able to repeat sentences. There are instructions further down for how to actually provide this screener and complete the screener with a student. But it is something you can use with children if you are interested. I'm going down because this is like let's see, there's that page, and then there's like a follow-up page. And then there's additional things like when you're doing expressive vocabulary, these are the pictures you would show them. Oh, what is this thing? Oh, it's an airplane. Okay, what is this? It's an orange. See if they can say these things. Um, so again, this one, it's a little cumbersome. You have to actually just kind of like look through it and understand what each of the pieces are. But it kind of highlights what I would do as a speech therapist giving an evaluation. I would do much longer versions of similar tests with a child.
Just,
Um,
just to
yes,
clarify,
yeah.
so the kindergarten speech and language, so those children have to be like they would be kindergarten age then, correct?
So, like I said, you can use it with younger children, but I just would want to make sure you're taking alongside that, you're looking at maybe those milestone charts that I gave you to give to the teachers that say, like, oh, by 4 years old, they should be answering who, what, where questions. By 5 years old, they should be answering when and where, or when and why. So that if you're giving it to a younger child, you know that, okay, I don't expect them to answer the why question. I don't expect them to answer the when question. It can still be a point of information collecting. And you can show it, you can use it as a way to speak to parents about, like, oh, your child is 3 years old. We really do expect children at this age to be able to answer who questions. And I noticed when I gave this, your child isn't able to answer a who question. So as long as you're paying attention to what the expected milestone is and the age of the child, you can use it. Just know that there are certain pieces that you wouldn't expect them to do. Sorry. And the last thing would be for children who you have trouble understanding because you think there's some concerns about their articulation. I may have handed this one out in the past. This one's been around for ages, but it's an articulation screener. And so this is the sheet that the teacher fills out. You just check off next to a word if they got it right. If they got it wrong, you would write what the sounds were that they made to the best of your ability, or what you think you heard the child say. And that's 2 pages, and what it does is it corresponds with the sheet that you would put in front of the child. So there's 2 sheets of images. This, as you can see, it's a piano. And so you would ask the child, oh, what's this? And they say piano. Now, if they say piano with a B sound, you're on page 1. You're gonna, put like an X here, and you're gonna write piano instead of piano so that you know what it was that they did wrong. And this is fun to do, actually, Susan. I don't know if you guys ever do any like, um, maybe faculty meetings or anything. Like it could be fun to play around and have teachers practice giving a screener to one another. And even, a teacher might intentionally say a word wrong so that the other teacher practicing with them can practice how to write down what they said. That could be a fun way to sort of practice with it because it can be a little intimidating when you first go to do these and you're like, oh gosh, I have to look at the picture. I have to find the word on the paper. I have to write down, I have to be listening and paying attention to what they said. And honestly, you have to be watching what they say too. Sometimes our ears think we hear what we're supposed to hear. And then when you watch a child, you realize that's not the sound they made at all. We're just so used to filling in those gaps with our own minds. So you do have to have a bit of visual information as well when you're completing these. So when I was in graduate school, that was always the most fun, was getting together with the other students and practicing doing these kinds of things on each other to see what it was really like. Oops, hold on a second. There we go. I'm going to get back to the slideshow here, but those are just some examples of screeners that you can use. They're free, that you can take them, use them as often as you need to. If there's something more specific you're looking for, You can sometimes find things on Teachers Pay Teachers. I would, try to validate that it was created by like a speech pathologist or something like that, because you want to make sure that whatever you're using, it's not just, oh, Joe down the street thinks that a 5-year-old should be able to do this. Make sure you're using something from some reputable sources. But those ones that I've collected for you are the ones that I use mainly if I'm asked to go in and just screen a child before I'm asked to evaluate. So then what do you do with all the data that you've collected if you've done one of these screeners, or you've just been sitting around making observations and writing certain things down about a child that you're concerned about? The first step is going to be to connect with the child's caregivers. And the best line that I use when I'm opening up these kinds of discussions is, you know, um, as you sit down to have your meeting, you can say, so what are some things that you're observing at home? And sometimes they might jump right in with a concern that you already have. And there you go. That's the easy way to get into that conversation. Sometimes they might say they have no concerns at all. Things are going wonderfully. And so that's where you might say something along the lines of, oh, okay, here at school, we've noticed, and you can give examples of the observations that you've taken. When your child is at circle time, she's always raising her hand, or she's not raising her hand, she's always interrupting others, and we've worked with her on waiting her turn, but we're just wondering, does she interrupt a lot at home and things like that? So turn it into a back and forth conversation about what you're observing at school, and maybe ask if that same thing is happening at home. And as you start to have a dialogue, you might find some common ground with your parents in the things that you're seeing and the things that they're observing as well. If there are concerns, things like, oh, your child, yeah, we've noticed that she says these words, these words, these words, but she's reaching 2 years old now, and children at this age typically would have about 100 words, and we have, checked off, we've tracked how many different words she uses here at school. Are there any words at home that she might be using that aren't on this list? And that gives the parents the opportunity to say, like, oh, yeah, she has a bunch of other words, or no, these are really the only words she uses at home. Okay, now you've opened up that dialogue to be able to say, okay, so according to these milestones, a child should have this many words. We might want to take a closer look, or we might want to keep an eye on this. So these are the ways that you're going to start those conversations, and it involves the parent in a collaborative way. So it's not telling them that there's something wrong with their child. It's more like problem solving together. The other thing you can do is, if your school has an academic support team, whether it's other teachers who might have experience with children with certain challenges or concerns, you get together and you kind of discuss what are ways that we can help the child in the classroom. What are some things we can do to encourage them to learn more words or to say this sound more clearly? And then you try to implement those ideas in the classroom, and you continue to record your observations. It's okay if you notice improvements, but over maybe like 4 or 5 weeks. And if you're starting to see things change in a positive direction, you could just keep going with it. Keep in touch with the parents. Let the parents know, like, we're doing this at school and it seems to be getting better. But if things are slow or very limited, this is where you might have to talk to the parent about um, is seeking an outside evaluation. So you might have to say something like, we talked about implementing this strategy in the room, and we've been working with her on learning more words for familiar objects. And over the course of the past 4 weeks, we've tracked, and she's only learned 2 new words. We would really expect her to learn more by now. We might want to ask a professional to come in and do an evaluation. And you always need to obtain parent permission before having an evaluation done. You can't just call someone up and say, hey, can you come in and check out my student? The parents have to give consent, but you want to make sure that the parents are on board with it, and you present it to them in a way that shows, like, what, we're trying. We just want to get some more ideas. We want to have a deeper look, and it's all going to benefit your child. So when you're addressing these concerns with caregivers, you want to make sure, first of all, that you're being proactive. You always want to start your year by building and maintaining positive rapport with your caregivers, and that you're frequently sharing information about developmental milestones. It doesn't have to be when there's a concern. This is information that you can give out to parents at the beginning of the year. Oh, here's your beginning of the year packet of information, we've included for you in there the milestones that children achieve in learning to speak and in learning different language skills. It's at their disposal. They'll already have it. If you're having a discussion about classroom observations, I love that sandwich technique. Make sure you start out with highlighting a child's strengths, and then you can talk about your concerns and frame them as questions, right? Again, you want this to be a dialogue. You don't just want to talk at the parents. You want to make sure that they're involved and invested and feel like they're being heard as well. And then empathize with them. If they're having a moment of feeling emotional, Susan and I were talking about how sometimes this is the first time a parent might be hearing that there's a concern about their child. So remember to approach it from a place of empathy. Remember that it could be hard for a parent to hear these words. They might need to stop the conversation, especially if the concerns are very large. They might ask to hold off and collect their thoughts. That was something I actually told the parents was if you're feeling overwhelmed, it's okay to pause. It's okay to say, can I have a day or two to collect my thoughts and come back to you with questions? Just make sure that you, as the professional, are reaching out after an appropriate amount of time. It's been a couple of days since we talked. I know you wanted to have some time to think about things. Are there any specific questions that you've thought of as you've been thinking about this? Just try to make sure you're maintaining that connection. And again, as you're talking about all the expectations for a child, you want to frame them in the context of development. This is what we expect a child to be doing by this age. And again, it's a continuum, so we're not giving hard and fast ages, but around this age, we would hope to see this. We're wondering if we can take a deeper look. If parents are really hesitant, I sometimes suggest that they discuss things with their pediatrician. And there are three areas that I really always suggest they talk to their pediatrician. If you're concerned about vocal quality, if a child is always hoarse, they probably need to see an ENT. There's probably something medical going on there. If a child is refusing to speak in certain situations, that's usually going to require the help of a mental health counselor. So again, they might want to reach out to the pediatrician first. Or if they're showing a complete regression of skills, so a child who was previously talking, answering to their name, following directions, and there's a very sudden reversal of all of those skills, that is going to warrant a discussion with a pediatrician. So those are the times when I would refer a parent to speak to their doctor. And then the last thing you want to do, if you do have concerns and you want to make a request for an evaluation, it's really important that you help them understand that process. And so I'm just going to go really quickly through this because you guys have all this information and I know we're running low on time here. But the things that happen in the evaluation process, you're probably going to be asked to do a questionnaire, and then a speech language pathologist is going to do like an observation, and then they're going to take the child separately to do all of the other things listed here, exams for oral musculature, articulation skills, receptive and expressive language, and then they're probably going to give you a questionnaire to ask about those social or pragmatic language skills. And so this is information you can share with a parent too. If there's going to be an evaluation, you can say, okay, based on my understanding, these are the things that are going to happen. If a child is then identified as needing some kind of speech language therapy, they're going to be given an IEP. If they're under 3 years old, they're going to be given what's called an IFSP. And this is just the document that outlines what goals a child will need to work towards to get back to where we think they need to be as far as their speech and language skills. But it is a legally binding document. So if a child is supposed to be receiving speech and language therapy, through an IEP or an IFSP. It's oftentimes going to happen in the school, although for that birth to three set, a lot of times it happens in the home, so you might not have to worry about it as much if you're in the classroom. But those 3 to 5 year olds, a lot of times speech therapy does happen at school. And so it's going to be up to you and up to the speech therapist to make sure that the goals and the services that are listed on the IEP are happening, and that you're making room for these people to come into your classroom or to take children out of the classroom to provide these services. This is just a little bit about the types of goals that we set for children: specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. And the most important thing here that I want to talk about in reference to the IEP is just that the success of a child who has been identified as a child needing speech or language therapy is that we need to make sure we are collaborating with service providers so that we can carry over whatever those therapy skills are into the classroom and then share that information with parents so they can carry over those skills at home, those strategies that they're using or words that they need to be practicing. It needs to be happening in all of these environments for the child to be able to carry over and practice those skills and make it part of their routine. Some of you have probably seen pull out versus push in therapy. I love push in therapy in the Montessori classroom. And if you ever have concerns about how to invite a care or pardon me, a service provider into your room and incorporate them into your classroom, I'm happy to discuss. I'm also trying to be respectful of your time here. Um, and so the other thing that's in here, I've provided this list in the past. These are just the supports you can use in the classroom if you have concerns for a child. So Susan has a copy
Yeah,
of this.
I'll share the
Yeah,
slides too, so you can take a look at it later if you don't. I'm recording this as well, but you can take a look at just the slides just to get these
yeah.
reports and
Yeah, there's a lot of information on these last few slides, and I don't necessarily love to go point by point because nobody wants to listen to me talk for that long. Um, but but you can certainly go through it. It breaks down all of the different domains: articulation, fluency, vocabulary, receptive language, etc. And we even go into expressive and pragmatic language skills as well. So feel free to look through all those. If anything ever comes up and you have a question, oh, I have this concern. I tried the support you mentioned. It's not working, or what do you mean by that? Please, reach out to me via email, talk to Susan. She's got my contact information. She can certainly get us in touch with one another, and I'm happy to talk you through any concerns that you have for any particular students of yours. So I'm just going to quickly go to this last screen so you have my contact information there, but I think we can also put it into the chat like we did for parents. That might be good for you to save. So if you ever feel like you need to reach out to me. And thank you all so much for your time. I know it's a long day and many of you are still working in the classroom, so I appreciate you taking the time to listen to me. Um, I am happy to stick around for a couple of minutes if anybody has questions and is able to stick around. But I also recognize that you are all working at the moment. So
so I put your email in the chat, and I'll
great.
distribute the recording and also the slideshow if there's any for the specifics, and you can review. And if you have any questions, you can send them to Jess, unless anyone has anything right now. You're welcome to ask. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Jessa. Nice to see you. And thank you so much for presenting again. And thanks everyone for listening and being here.
Yes, thank you, everyone. It's always a great time talking to all of you. Thank you, Susan.
Bye.
Bye.